What's up, everybody? It's Soren Baker here on Unique Access Entertainment. As always, please hit that subscribe button. It's right down there and it's free. That enables us to keep coming to you guys as often as possible with as many interviews as possible. So please hit that subscribe button, like our content, share it, talk about it, be about it, each one, teach one. And we appreciate your guys' support getting us this far. Now, today we have the honor and privilege of being joined by an incredible filmmaker, Nick Broomfield. Thank you for coming through, sir.
How do you do? Great to be on.
Yes, thank you very much for your time. You have a brand new film that's coming out, Last Man Standing, Suge Knight and the Murders of Biggie and Tupac, premiering on Stars. Congratulations on that and all your work over the years. So this film, for those that have been following your career like me, they saw Biggie and Tupac back in the day, and you've done a lot of very interesting documentaries. So given that you had done Biggie and Tupac, what made you want to revisit it at this particular moment?
Well, I think there were two things. One was that Suge Knight went to prison. So a lot of people who hadn't been prepared to talk suddenly felt safer talking. So they were much more open. There were a lot of people who worked at death row, often from Suge's gang, who were suddenly happy to take part in the film. And so, that was one very compelling reason. The other was I felt the treatment of Russell Poole, who was the police officer who originally came up with the notion that the LAPD officers were involved in the hit on Biggie, was treated so badly by the department, disrespectfully, I would say. And the poor guy actually had a heart attack, still arguing his case at the sheriff's office at the headquarters in Los Angeles. And I just felt, I liked Russell a great deal. I believed in what he was doing. I think his work was very thorough, and subsequent developments have borne out his theories, which of course I explored in the original film, Biggie and Tupac. So it was very much, I felt, to uphold what Russell had been saying with new evidence that I made the new film.
Yeah, well, in Last Man Standing, that's one of my favorite parts is toward the end of the film, of course, but you talk about it in detail about how some of the other findings with Greg Kading and other people have put forth theories that not only do you think they're inaccurate, but they also are seemingly very easy to prove that they're inaccurate. So my question to you then is, why do you feel as though Greg Kading and some of the other people's theories have gained so much traction over the years?
Well, I think, Greg Kading came after Russell Poole. I think he did his best to discredit Russell. But the central part of his theories is that none of these LAPD officers, mainly Perez and Mack and the other guys, had ever worked for death row. And I actually have the police chief, Bernard Park, saying we know that they worked for death row records off duty, as well as a whole bunch of people who worked at death row had all seen them. So that's a very big hole straight away in Greg Kading's argument. And there are other things as well. I mean, I think that there was, involvement in discrediting Russell at a very high level. And, we have a judge in the film saying that two detectives had actually been themselves charged with intimidating witnesses who were in prison at the time. Very, very strong evidence too, suggesting that Mack and Perez were present at the Motor Museum, Peterson Motor Museum, the night that Biggie was shot, which was also new evidence that came up. So I just felt, it's just not acceptable to trash somebody with really no strong supporting evidence. I mean, Greg Kading did a fantastic job, I think, with the Tupac murder. And he came up with new evidence, and he had a very good supporting theory. His work on the Biggie case is very, very flimsy. And his main witness is somebody who he himself says would not be a credible witness in court. So, I just feel the record needs to be set straight.
Yeah. Well, I think the film Last Man Standing does a great job of that. And I also feel as though with Russell Poole in particular, why do you think he wasn't respected more by the media in the sense that, you know, you have Biggie and Tupac, you have a lot of other reporting that was going on at the time, that his puzzles seemed to make a lot of sense. But even before Kading and some other people came out to discredit it, that line of thought didn't really take off. What's your theory as to why that's the case?
Um, I don't know that that's necessarily true. I mean, I think there was a lot of media attention paid to Russell. I think it's like with all these other theories over time, they kind of lose credibility. I mean, think of all the theories about President Kennedy's assassination, you know, linking it to government agencies. And so I think after a while, people just sort of get tired of hearing the same stuff, and it sort of disappears into the ether. I think that's really, you know, and it's very reassuring to hear, you know, when someone like Greg Kading comes along and says, well, actually, this is just a crazy theory, and it was just a gang, killing after all. It kind of sets, you know, people, I think, like to live in a world where there's some rhyme and reason and normality and routine. And when somebody comes up with a very radical theory that police officers were involved in the murder of Biggie Smalls, it's very disturbing. It disturbs our reality. So it's very reassuring to discredit Russell, I think. Of course, we have to remember that the same police officers were involved in the Rampart scandal, and the LAPD actually had to pay out something like, you know, 150 million in compensation to the various victims. So, you know, Russell wasn't sort of just fabricating ideas. It was firmly rooted in reality.
Yeah. And to your point, people at times are very uncomfortable with reality. And that being said, I was also very intrigued in Last Man Standing, the new film that you have, that so many people were so open to criticize Tupac and to talk about him being not being a gang member, getting beat up, being you know, a lot of things that don't really get talked about. So what made now the time for also people to want to discuss Tupac in a way that we don't normally see?
Well, I think, you know, people love Tupac, first of all. You know, I don't think any of the people who came up with these thoughts about him did it out of dislike for Tupac. I think Tupac's a very complicated and deeply talented, probably genius, who came from a very unusual background. With his mother was a Black Panther and so on. Was a small guy, was very badly bullied growing up. And so I think, in a way, being surrounded by these big gangster characters who had beaten and probably killed endless numbers of people was kind of oddly reassuring, and he liked playing that part. He was an actor, and who I think was also, you know, deeply politically committed, and he had all these aspirations which his mother had very much instilled in him growing up. And other people, you know, I think he had a conscience and was there to be a great spokesperson, but he also had this other rather contradictory side, which was he loved hanging out with the gangsters and being the man, you know.
Right. Yeah. It's just that the kind of combination of Tupac and Suge, I think, is very interestingly explored in Last Man Standing. So, for you, what new wrinkles did you learn or uncover about their relationship that intrigued you?
Well, I think, you know, Suge's niece talks about how they were, you know, just best buddies, and they hung out together and they did things together. And I think Tupac found somebody that he really liked in Suge. I don't think it was, I mean, obviously Suge got him out of prison, but I think past that, they obviously enjoyed each other's company a great deal. And they, as the niece says in the film, they shared a particular lifestyle. And you can kind of see it in the footage that we have in the film. You can see that they kind of adored each other. And I think Tupac was sort of playing this role of gangster, you know, and Biggie just happened to be the unfortunate, you know, enemy, although he really didn't deserve to be at all. And it all just sort of got rather out of hand. And I think probably a lot of drugs and not enough sleep probably made things a lot more crazy than they would have been.
Right. And Suge's niece you're referring to is Crystal Anderson, correct?
Right.
Now, also in the film, in the beginning of Last Man Standing, she talks about Suge being the baby of the family and being doted on. So as he rose to power, you have several people in the film talk about, in Last Man Standing, talk about how Suge wasn't able to handle the power. So, and didn't obviously delegate it in a good way, according to most everybody. So did you draw or see any correlations to being the baby in the family? And then was he trying to overcome stuff? Was he trying to overcompensate like Tupac? Like, what did you think? What were some of your conclusions?
Well, I mean, from talking to, you know, the other members of the Mob Pirus and so on, and people who knew him very well from when he was a kid, because they all grew up kind of on the same block. You know, Suge came from a very good family, apparently. You know, his parents stayed together. His father had a job. Mother was very hardworking. He, I think, was prevented by his parents from playing with a lot of the other gang members. You know, they wanted Suge to do well. They wanted Suge to go to college, which he did. And I think this is what I'm getting from the gang members, was that Suge felt he'd sort of missed out on the fun. You know, here were all these guys creating chaos and confusion on the streets and having a good old laugh. And he was studying at home and being, you know, not allowed to play with them. I think we all want to, you know, the thing you're prevented from doing is the thing that makes you very curious. So when he came out of Las Vegas University and came back to LA and had the ability, I think, to employ some of these people and to run Death Row Records, he ran it in that sort of gang way. This is something he wanted to do. It was kind of, you know, like his fantasy, I guess, of the kind of life he wanted to lead. And I think, you know, his parents supported him and have always been incredibly loving towards him. So it wasn't like he was raised to be, you know, some kind of psycho, far from it.
Right. So with Last Man Standing, you do put some footage from Biggie and Tupac in, including your interview that you had with Suge while he was incarcerated.
Right.
So what happened with trying to get Suge for an interview for Last Man Standing?
Well, he was very resistant. I mean, maybe he didn't like the original film, Biggie and Tupac. It was certainly hard to get him into that film. In fact, we had a sort of blanket permission to film in the prison, and Suge Knight and Death Row had sort of turned us down. And we just sort of arrived at his cell door and said, "So do you want to do an interview, Suge?" He was like rather surprised, and I think probably because he wanted to get out of prison on parole, and we happened to be with the warden, he decided to do the interview. So, you know, it wasn't like we got sort of carte blanche to get him. That was kind of a miracle we got him then. And this time we tried extremely hard. In fact, we knew one of his cellmates, and we approached his wife, and she was sending messages to the cellmate and our phone numbers, and Crystal tried too. And, you know, it wasn't, you know, other than climbing over the gates ourselves and, you know, sneaking our way into the prison, we tried every damn thing that was possible. So he obviously just didn't want to talk. And I think, you know, he's probably under a lot of pressure now.
Yeah.
So it's probably not a lot of things he really wants to talk about.
Yeah. And that to that point brings it full circle to the beginning of Last Man Standing, that the Terry Carter murder scene is the opening of the film. So as a filmmaker, what made you want to open it with that story, that scene?
Well, that's Suge's reality at the moment. He's spending all this time in prison because of that murder. And that's the situation that created the opportunity to talk to so many people who hadn't talked before. So that needed to be stated kind of as the reality that the film was taking place in. It was, Suge's situation has changed very much since, I think it was 2001 when we did the original interview. And in that intervening years, he lost an enormous amount of power. He obviously, death row just did not come back, and all his attempts to resuscitate his career didn't work. And he just sort of spiraled into this awful situation that culminated in that murder.
Yes. And with the spiraling, one of the really interesting and insightful quotes I thought was from Joe Cool, Snoop's cousin, in Last Man Standing. And he talked about hiring Compton's worst, which was Suge's policy, according to Joe Cool. And the thing I thought was interesting about that is that on the one hand, you could say it's great that he was giving jobs to guys that had been incarcerated or this or that, but it's the ones he chose that were incarcerated, maybe not the right guys. So as you learned from these new interviews with Mob James, C-Style, Joe Cool, what did you glean from those interviews that gave you a better insight of how Suge operated?
Well, again, a bit like with Tupac, he was sort of play acting the gangster. I think what they all said was he started off as a kind of, executive running a company, and then sort of fell in love with the role of wearing the red suits and having the big cigar and having his face on the front of all the magazines. And, he became this big personality instead of being somebody who was discreet and in the background. He became this, Suge Knight, a name that got people probably running around the corner and down the street and terrified to come in. And all these stories kind of his treatment of people, became his reality, I think. And he was kind of living this part. I mean, I think that, as I said, when he grew up, it was the gangsters that he hadn't, or the gang members that he hadn't been able to play with, who were now suddenly in death row, who were his homies. And so for him, it was a fulfillment of a dream that he, hadn't been able to have as a kid. It's kind of very interesting in a way, only that dream overtook him. I mean, it possessed him and destroyed him.
Yeah, and I thought the part from Mob James comparing Death Row to a Cinderella story, I'd never had thought of it that way, but I thought it was one of the more profound and intriguing statements. So as a director, when someone says something like that to you, like what happens to you?
Well, I mean, I have to say I was very surprised by Mob James. He's a really thinking, evolved person who obviously had an incredibly difficult upbringing, very abusive father who used to sort of whip him with barbed wire and stuff and caused him, I think, terrible trauma. And then, fell in love with violence and dishing it out. And then I think, partly, he talks about it in the film, partly through the death of his brother, he suddenly realized that, like with the death of his brother, he had caused so much heartbreak for other people who lost their sons, their brothers, and I think he says in the film, he wanted to give back. He wanted to do something positive to, kind of in a way make up for all the stuff he'd done. And so, and he's very moving, I think, in the film Mob James. I mean, to see him crying over his brother and, real tears of grief, and to let all that emotion in and use it in a positive way, I thought was pretty amazing, actually. I was very moved by him.
Yeah, me too. I think he gives some of the best commentary, most insightful commentary in the film. So that's a credit to you as a director for bringing that out. So that was awesome.
Be sure to check out The History of Gangster Rap by Soren Baker. He's official.
History of Gangster Rap features exclusive interviews with Ice-T, Snoop Dogg, MC Ren, the D.O.C, and dozens of others. The History of Gangster Rap, a definitive look at how Los Angeles changed rap forever.
In Los Angeles, the streets definitely set the tone of the hip-hop music.
At 19, I got a $50,000 car.
My whole angle always was, I'll be street, but I will always tell you the horrors that go along with this life.
It will be penalties and casualties for just wearing the wrong color in somebody's neighborhood.
And once gangster rap made it from the streets to the TV, the genre exploded.
With Fab 5 on Yo MTV Raps with NWA.
Yo MTV, it just catapulted us from being local heroes to national gangbang rappers.
The History of Gangster Rap discusses it all from 1980 up till today.
It's always gonna be shit happening in the streets. You know what I mean? So it's always gonna be something to talk about.
The History of Gangster Rap in stores now.